ongoing lockdown of Lagos and Ogun states, as well as Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, is just one out of a number of measures announced by President Muhammadu Buhari as efforts intensify to contain a possible spread of the coronavirus outbreak in the country. For a point-by-point conversation now on the entire presidential address, we are being joined from our Arise Abuja studio by Dr. Sam Amadi, a lawyer and also the former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Dr. Amadi was a fellow at the Care Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And until December 2010, he held the position of Special Advisor to the President of the Senate of Nigeria. He was also a director of the Center for Public Policy and Research in Lagos, Nigeria, and a senior legal officer at the Human Rights Law Service in Nigeria. He's also a member of the Nigerian Bar Association. Doctor, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Sam Amadi, good morning, and thank you for joining us again on the morning show. Well, you listened to Leila's introduction. Simply, we would like you to help us assess where we are right now in Nigeria with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures that have been taken so far by the Nigerian government and some of the states, and particularly the president's nationwide address on Sunday, which came a little bit late. Do you think that right now the president having resumed from his prolonged siesta, to use Professor Wole Soyinka's words, has now taken full charge? And what else do you expect to see?
Thank you very much. I think first, let's start with the president's speech. Long siesta, short siesta, the critical thing now is that the president's speech came perhaps a little late, but also at the right time, because this is when we are moving to perhaps a critical stage in the management of this pandemic. We are now at the stage of trying to avoid community infection, in the sense that the few or the unconfirmed, unverified, unconfirmed cases of those who probably have this virus and their interaction with community where they belong or where they will travel to is critical to define the next phase, whether we're going to have, as feared, a bedlam or something manageable. So the speech perhaps came at the right time in that context. And essentially, the president had two objectives. First is, he says, look, we want to protect the life of our citizens. And the second objective is I want to protect the means of livelihood, which is basically the approach that most countries in the world are looking at. You first have to prevent this disease from spreading further and cure those who are already affected. At the same time, we want to preserve, as much as we can, the economic, the prospect of prosperity post-COVID. And so strategically, the central bank has been on that, rolling out monetary policies, trying to control liquidity, which is one of the IMF requirements or suggestions. You maintain liquidity, and at the same time, ensure that businesses do not go under. And so some of the monetary policy, fiscal policy, and also financial interventions has been to strengthen the capacity of these companies. The House of Reps has come with a good plan around rebate for companies that return employment. But primarily, I think the president's speech, the high point of it, which is the lockdown, I think is the right thing to do now, because if you look at the assumption that Lagos and Abuja has been the site for transmitting further transmission of this virus to neighboring states, it therefore means that if you can isolate Lagos, keep Lagos traffic low, as well as keep interaction between Lagos and Lagos, Ogun, and Abuja and other states, then you have a better chance of testing, tracing, contacting, testing, and isolating. Now, the critical thing is that this 14 days window, perhaps, arguably, should have come earlier than now. With the first index case and a few of the cases coming up, it was clear that Lagos and Abuja, because this is, interestingly, a virus that comes through via those who came from outside the country. So Lagos, Abuja is the major port of entry, apart from Port Harcourt. And of course, if we had done this earlier, perhaps, in a much more strategic and, calibrated way, maybe some of these other cases from Ogun State and other parts of the country would have been able to contend that. Again, the president was right on that. The issue around palliative, you see, clearly there's a sentence in that speech that is very important. He understood that there will be crisis with livelihood, the social livelihood support system in the rural area, in the outskirts of Abuja and Lagos. And he says there will be relief intervention, food relief to those places. The question is, do we have the infrastructure with the Ministry of Humanitarian Services? Are we able to help deliver supplies to those parts of Abuja or Lagos where we don't expect people to have the capacity to stockpile, where we don't expect people to have the capacity probably to do online transactions? So primarily, the effectiveness at the level of strategy, the speech was right. It cleared the checkpoints. It focused on isolation. It focused on control of transmission. It focused also on interventions in the big areas of, for example, school feeding, which also is a problem. How do you trace them to their parents? And of course, issues around support for Lagos, which is a big one, and support for Abuja. But primarily, I think what is missing now is, since they should have had breakdown by ministers or officers of government to explain the logistics for delivering on those, palliative and social interventions to kind of reduce the impact of this lockdown in Lagos, Abuja, and Ogun State. That's a missing angle. And so what we expected after the speech, that we will see further iteration. It was good that the CBN governor and Minister of Finance came out to talk about the financial sector, some skeletal work, and giving them a waiver so that they could be able to support financial transactions. But we needed greater degree of specifications around how affects the issues around contacting and tracing, testing, and the issues around social support would have been implemented. We don't have clarity. And today, most Nigerians are under a greater fear that the lockdown in these three key states would perhaps create more anxiety than even the fear of the COVID-19. So primarily, I think a good strategic speech at that level, fair enough, longer than the president has done before. And of course, it dispels the rumor around where is the president, is he strong and all that. We saw a president who, for about 15 minutes at least, stood well, spoke well. But the bigger issues around the management of the pandemic, and also the management of the socioeconomic impact expected of this lockdown. We need to hear more about that, and that's where we are right now.
Certainly, Dr. Amadi, thank you for raising that point. And you say that you believe that the president's speech came at the right time. Others may believe that maybe a president should be giving several speeches throughout a pandemic, and this speech is kind of like medicine after death. What would you say to that? Because, I mean, in his speech, he also mentioned that there is always an underreaction, an overreaction, and the right reaction. Has his administration had the right reaction to this entire situation? And I say this for little points such as you mentioned the school feeding program, etc., and how we can make sure that these things are actually going to work and continue in fruition. We also have several of our billionaires all coming out and pledging 1 billion naira each in the fight against coronavirus, yet we're seeing that this money is going straight to the federal government. People are weary. Is this money going to trickle down to the average man or woman who may need it, etc.? Do you really think that there is enough transparency? Do you really think that our government has had the right reaction to the COVID-19 outbreak?
I don't think they've had the right reaction. I think we lost a window of opportunity. The index case happened, we had a month after the index case before this speech. Again, we had about a month or two when we started having Europe and Americas and Russia, China as well, got kind of hit badly by this virus. We didn't begin to put in place the structure, the infrastructure for dealing with this. For example, take issues around information. I was in Owerri, a couple of weeks ago as a source person to train new commissioners, and somebody flew in from London who was appointed SA and went straight to the meeting and interacted. People were surprised. Nobody actually understood the issues around isolation. So basically, we didn't even do enough of information management within this period. So today, we are struggling now with letting communities, rural areas, traditional rulers, churches understand the basic issues around social distancing. This we should have done months before now, if we had the operational capability to get this thing done. The problem is this: the government is weak on operation. We have a weak government, not efficient in my view at all levels in terms of delivery. It's good to have where we have the NCDC guy and the president says we have a great guy in Chichikwe, but that's not what gets this job done. It's about how you prime your institutions to deliver at a critical time. So we did a terrible job. We didn't prepare. The state of preparedness before now was too poor. think in terms of, for example, issues around tracing. Look at the corporate response. It should have been mobilized early. Nigerian corporate guru was there to be mined. It was not mobilized early. So by today, these billions are coming. Would have gone to set up centers, testing centers, providing testing kits, providing isolation centers, and preparing medical facilities, optimizing them for curative functions. So basically, we laid back. Of course, we couldn't have manufactured a structure. We have been running a very ponderous, inefficient structure. And I think in terms of inconsistency, some governors went ahead and started closing down borders, which I agree with the SGF, illegal actions. Now, if there were streamlined relationship between the states and the federal government, and the federal government has been proactive in these measures, they would have set standard guidelines for calibrated responses so that each state knows what's a big deal, closing the border between Edo and Delta. So these are things that should be synchronized. The point is right about consistency, about coherence, but the government didn't have the capacity to deliver at that level. So I don't think they responded very well. I think we responded late. I think we responded in a staccato manner. I think we are not coherent, comprehensive. And we wouldn't have trimmed and primed institutions to deliver. So basically, at the level of enlightenment, leadership is missing big time, where people are still struggling with accepting the fact that this virus does not respect gene nor weather. People are still struggling with, the idea about social distancing. In rural areas, people are still having weddings, having funerals, because there's no cascade from up to down. So in my view, well, when I said it was appropriate at this time, the speech, I meant that I said it should have happened before now. But it also, second, they said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time was now. Now, in the sense that we're now seeing a new phase in this virus, which is this phase of possible community, infection. Are we going to have people spread around their communities? Are we going to be getting numbers like 200, 300? As we get our testing to up to 1,000, are we going to have like 900 cases? This is why this timing is good, because this is the time now we could lock down Abuja. I think it's a good idea. Lock down Lagos, I think it's a good idea. But when you lock them down, what do you do is what matters. Are you moving around tracing, effectively tracing, testing and isolating, so that by the time you lift that 14-day window, with the collateral damage to livelihood, to income, to business, but at least there will be a cost benefit will be that, look, we're no longer infecting the neighboring states because we've controlled the population of those who have the virus in Abuja and Lagos. So really at this stage now, we want to hear more about what should be done. Operation. For example, the Minister of Humanitarian Services talks about, we've started delivering cash to beneficiaries. How? Which database? Who are these persons? What methodology? Yesterday, we have from the British authorities about plans to airlift their citizens who are trapped elsewhere. And then they told you they're going to have a government, a flight travel agent manage it. And now they're setting out on the government website how you can identify where you are and say, this is the country I'm not able to book a flight. So there must be structure that tells people what is being done. Transparency. Who are these people who are going to benefit? Under what categorization? Are they going to be persons who don't have a job? Do we have a database of these people? Are they going to be persons who have been on government stipend before in terms of the trader money and other conditional cash transfer? What's the framework? So I think we don't have the capacity yet. I think the leadership, both the task force and the ministries and departments, apart from NCDC, have not shown that capacity.
Sorry to interrupt you. We'll take a short commercial break now. When we return, the conversation with you will continue. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Still with us in our Abuja studio is Dr. Sam Amadi, a lawyer and former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, who has been helping us to reflect further on the national address by President Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria and measures being taken by the Nigerian government to address the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Dr. Amadi, before we went on break, you had said a number of things about transparency and accountability. But let's focus a little bit on social distancing. We've had some guests on this program. Yesterday, it was Shinwani Kulakwokoti. This morning, we had Captain Umar Aliyu Babangida, who had expressed concerns about social distancing. And their view is that this doesn't take into account, while it may be a good model from elsewhere, China and Europe and the United States, that it doesn't take into account the peculiar circumstances of Nigerian citizens who live in the slums or who live in, face me, I face you, cultural, architectural units, for the simple reason, as Aliyu Babangida pointed out, that it's probably better to disperse some people than to keep them together. Second, I'd like to have your thoughts on what you think should be the approach by the security agencies who are now part of the equation in terms of enforcement. And we know our security agents, they tend to overreach themselves. What kind of human rights protocols should the Inspector General of Police and the heads of the other agencies insist upon from their operatives who will be on the streets in Lagos, Ogun, and the Federal Capital Territory for now to enforce the restriction lockdown order?
Well, thank you. I think the concept of social distancing is, I've tried to think about it conceptually, social distancing or is it physical distancing. But the idea is basically the fact that we think that's perhaps the best way to reduce the rate of infection, in the sense that since it's a virus that is carried from human to human, then as much as possible, if we reduce the contact, then that's reasonable proportion is that, look, we're able to reduce and then be able to treat. Because in management of all risk, there are three frameworks for managing risk. First is identification. What's the nature of this risk? Then you look at the vulnerabilities, the risk factor, and then you look at mitigation. So you have to say, okay, how do we deal with it? You have to isolate. You have to understand. So part of social distancing is a framework in order to reduce the rate of infection. At the same time, create, break that virus, spread. But again, it comes against it rubs hard against some cultural exceptionalism. We do know, people say some part of this world, we are insular. People are on their own. People can easily keep to themselves. You have a family, wife, husband, and 3 children. Perhaps you have 3 rooms, everybody in their room, reading their books, play with their gadgets. And then you have societies where people are more communal. And then, therefore, the idea of isolation, which is counterintuitive. Our world is based on connection, intensification of the intensity, and velocity of transaction and network is what defines globalization. And now we are being counterintuitive. We are saying people should isolate themselves. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for some cultures. And come to Nigeria, especially where people live in slums. There's a typical iconic picture in India of people isolating themselves from their window, from their veranda, and it looks like a market because of the housing crisis. People are living in subhuman housing, contrary to the stipulated conditions of housing. And so how do those people do social distancing? Some people live face me or face you, typical Nigerian way, with maybe 9 children on both sides. How are they going to distance them? So clearly there will be challenges with that kind of, but the notion is very important in terms of travel, in terms of maybe gathering people, more than 10, 20 people in one place, the churches, the mosque, the markets. So I think we need to now accept that we need to move away from our exceptionalism, cultural or social. Oh, we like to bump into people, we like to shake hands. It was difficult for me not to shake hands. But after some time, you kind of auto-reverse. You really enjoy yourself socially, and then you start not shaking hands. So I think we should learn these things now and accept that, look, it's good towards dealing with the crisis. But then, of course, there's no sense that we're going to get 100% results. In the neighborhoods where people are living in slums, you will expect greater degree of violation or derogation. And by the way, if you look at international pictures of press conferences, some people keep better social distancing. If you watch the UK address, the ministers and the officials have greater space. Trump and his officials don't have that degree of space. So there will be some variations. The critical thing is that we understand what this means. Now, back to the question about law enforcement. I think this is where the character of the institution will show itself. The idea of law enforcement in this circumstance is to prevent people from moving and therefore possibly getting infected or spreading the virus. It's not an opportunity now to clamp down on people. It's not an opportunity to brutalize people. Some of the pictures we've seen and the video we've seen didn't quite look good. The good thing is that the IG of police, the Inspector of Police, has shown capacity to really protect human rights, punish police officers who probably violate the law. We should understand that these measures are to protect life, and part of human well-being is their dignity and their freedom. There's no point protecting people. The president says the focus is to protect the life of Nigerians. As such, therefore, it doesn't make sense to brutalize people, to injure people, and then they'll be taken to hospital where they will further stretch the capacity of the health facilities to deal with the real crisis. So we shouldn't create additional crisis through brutality. And this is the time now for messaging. This is the time now for the Inspector of Police, the DPOs, the Commissioner of Police, the AIGs, and all the command platform of the Nigerian Police Force and other security services. We now have a big job to create guidelines, simple guidelines. What do you do when you see people gathered illegally where they ought not? What do you do when you see people traveling when they shouldn't do? What do you do when you see meetings holding or church services or other social gatherings? How do you intercept, disperse, and perhaps arrest, if need be, those who ought to be arrested for perhaps instigating or leading those civic disobedience? So this is where messaging, management, the capacity of the institution to retrain itself, to push forward its best foot will be in display. I have no doubt that we're going to err, and then perhaps the learning curve will be slower or faster. Over time, reactions, media spotlight on misbehavior will now perhaps trigger managerial response, and over time perhaps we get better. But really, this is no excuse for violating human rights. And again, people should note, this is not an emergency declared according to the Constitution. The President has basically triggered the provisions of the Quarantine Act, and acting as Chief Executive has given directions on how the social space should be managed. This is not a national emergency of the type that human rights are suspended. This is not wartime. This is not a natural calamity. This is basically a pandemic, and the President and the government has taken calculated steps to contain and deal with the crisis. And therefore, it does not in any way suspend the human rights of Nigerians in any way at all. There's no law here talking about suspension of human rights. The only thing that has been suspended is movement, and of course, the various cities are in lockdown, but that does not mean that our rights have been locked down, basically. So I expect the police, the leadership of the police, the military, the other service chiefs to also begin to message that this is about civic engagement. This is where the security forces should be at their best, because every wrong behavior further increases the cost of this pandemic, and every good behavior further increases. We saw how people in Europe were hailing doctors and nurses and security agents who were really helping to take people to isolation centers, who are helping to make sure that the city, the state, everywhere is kept in order. That's what we want to see, and we should support the security services to do their job, but their job is to keep the peace, stop assemblage, disperse people, ensure that people obey the order, but not to brutalize or to injure or kill any person in this period.
Well, certainly, Dr. Amadi, and to be honest, around the world, you are seeing some leaders treating this pandemic as wartime. Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson, etc. But yes, crisis communication is absolutely key. And our last guest on the show, Captain Umar Aliyu Babangida, he mentioned pre-crisis management and post-crisis management. And I would like to get your assessment on what efforts you see and feel we are making towards post-crisis management. I mean, the 14-day lockdown is going to be over at some point. People are going to go back to normal business as usual. And there's also skepticism and maybe some general fear that this could maybe even cause another outbreak or further spreads. Do you think we're making enough effort with regards to post-crisis management? We only have a few seconds left.
Yeah, sure. The President based his advisory on the advisory of the NCDC. So my argument would be that I think that we have some people looking at the data. This is a period for us to assess after 14 days. Are we able to track, trace, and test? Now, what are the side effects? So there should be a balance sheet the good, the bad, the cost, the benefit. What do we achieve? What are the costs? So that after 14 days, you have to make a deliberate decision. You see, managing crisis, you manage with contingencies and uncertainties. And this is why your model, your science is critical. How do you assess the losses and the gains? As therefore, to make a decision as whether to continue with the policies or to retool them, you have to be intelligent, you have to have data, you have to observe, and of course, this presumes that those who are working from home are actually working from home and not that they are sleeping at home. This is a time to have a strong governance, time for executive presence, executive intelligence, so that you're able to gather the data, you're able to make critical, very important decisions, and those decisions benefit from good science and good facts. I think at this period of time, we expect government to be at its most alert. Yes, isolate yourself, but don't go to sleep. That's what it should be.
Well, thank you very much, Sam Amadi. Great delight having you on the morning show. And thank you very much for your insights.